everybody, this is Nahaz, and men lie, women lie, but stats don't lie. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 2. We're going to do a short video here talking about my predictions for the 8 direct invites to the Boston Major. You get yourself a sweet 2,000 Battle Pass points for predicting all 8 teams correctly in that compendium, and I'll also briefly comment on 6.88F, the new patch that was recently deployed to the client. So we're going to start by looking at the TI6 top 8 finishers. Of the top 12 finishers, Wings is the only team that is returning this season with its complete roster. And DC is the only other team to make one roster change or fewer. So all of the other teams, you're talking about a minimum 2 new players, and a lot of them have 3 or more. The other problem when you're looking at evaluating these teams is that most of them really haven't played all that many official matches since TI. There's really only been one undisputably premium LAN, that being MDL. Since then, there have been a number of other events, but a lot of them have either sort of unusual formats or a lot of online play. So it's going to be very difficult to kind of come up with an unambiguous statistical criterion to rank these teams. And quite frankly, none of us really know how Valve makes its invite decisions to begin with. So I'm going to do the best I can here to give you my 8 predictions. I think they're right, but there's also a lot of uncertainty, particularly when you get down to those last 3 teams. So you look at these teams, Evil Geniuses, of course, are returning 3 out of their top 5, out of their 5 players from TI6, where they finished in 3rd place, and it really becomes a mess from there. FNATIC is a top 4 finisher, but they're bringing in 3 new players to their roster. Now, it is significant in my mind that their 3 new players are all coming from another team that finished top 8 at TI, that being TNC. So I think they're looking pretty strong on paper. Of the top 8 finishers, EHOME is really the only team that's played more than 25 games. So they're the only team that you have that long track record that ideally you would want to have when evaluating a team. They're also bringing in 2 players with a very excellent pedigree in Garder and Sylar. MVP Phoenix, again, returns 3 out of 5 players, but they've been a lot more uneven, and the 2 players that they're bringing in are a lot less well known around the scene in terms of their track record and pedigree. Liquid, I think you certainly would have liked to see a lot more from them in terms of games. They're only 8 and 9 since TI6, but they are bringing in 2 extremely talented players, and that roster has to factor into the discussion when you're talking about potential. The other teams that we're looking at here, and I feel pretty confident that when you talk about the 8 Boston Major invites, they're really going to come from a group of 14 teams. The top 7 TI finishers and the 7 teams that we're going to talk about on this slide. I think Newbee, based on what you're seeing on paper, has got to be in the thick of the discussion. They only retained 2 out of their 5 players from TI6, but they're bringing in 3 players, 2 of which have a very strong track record. The third appears to be extremely talented. SCCC distinguished himself last season playing on, I believe it was either Newbee Young or CDAC. Avengers, I can't ever keep that straight. But they are 39 and 22 since TI6. They're 12 and 6 in their last 8 games, and they're really one of the few teams that's looked convincing in playing against EHOME and Wings. They've looked very, very good against the top teams in their region. They also finished 2nd place at MDL, and for much of that tournament, they really looked like the best team at the event. You look at their team stats over those games played at that MDL LAN. They have a 4.3 team KDA. The next closest team at the event was EG with 3.51. So they looked very, very convincing in their games at that event. SCCC, of course, as we mentioned in our last episode, has one of the finest Invoker performances that I'd ever seen. LGD, now, initially, when you started seeing LGD, they looked like they might have had promise. They made the decision to basically split their rosters. They have the main LGD squad and LGD Forever Young featuring Zhao 8. Both of them are bringing in a lot of new players, although you're going to recognize the names Super and Yao, of course, players that have really made a name for themselves playing on those top Chinese teams. But they neither of LGD's squads has really shown any kind of consistency or distinguished themselves LGD Forever Young was not in the top 4, and they finished in the bottom half of the field in MDL. And really the most concerning thing to me is that when you've watched LGD FY play, both against the top 2 teams in China right now, in my opinion, in EHOME and Newbee, and against their sister squad, LGD, they really just haven't looked convincing. I think based on what you've seen from this squad, they're kind of a long shot to me. Team Secret, very interesting move to me, bringing in 3 incredibly talented players from the SEA region. This is a bit of an experiment. Of course, their 2 supports, Puppy and Pilai Dai, returned from last season, anchoring that squad. They have had some pretty good games. They're 13-8 since TI6. They finished top 4 at MDL. They recently won the Face It Invitational. Again, the problem with that was a little bit of an unusual format. It was a best of 1 with best of 3 finals, and the teams that they beat weren't necessarily in the discussion in terms of the very elite teams in their region. They looked good in beating Vega, Empire, and Escape. I think that those are 3 teams that all have some promise going forward, but they aren't necessarily the teams that you'd put up there for that direct invite discussion. Execration is a team out of SEA that a lot of people were talking about. They returned and Abed from their TI6 wildcard squad. They add DJ, long considered one of the most talented players in the SEA region. Of course, played for FNATIC at TI6. Again, though, they showed some promise early on, looked like that they were going to be a dominant team in their region, but have really fallen off lately. They're 36-28 overall since TI6. As of about a month ago, they were 8-2 in Mineski Pro League, which is a regional tournament in SEA. Really looked like they were going to show the kind of dominance that might elevate them into the thick of this discussion. More recently, though, they just haven't been consistent. They lost in the finals of the Summit 6 SEA qualifiers to FNATIC. I really think that hurt their chances, although you can't argue this is a very talented, very scary team if they were to come through the qualifiers. OG, I think, is a very interesting case on paper. They only returned 2 of their 5 players from the last season. They've only played 17 matches. However, they are adding 2 veteran players in Jerax and S4 that have had a lot of success in their careers. Of course, when you look at this roster, 3 out of their 5 players appeared in multiple major finals last season. Anna, who's kind of the question mark, of course, was let out of a contract with, I believe it was IG Vitality, came back over and is now playing on that squad. And I think the biggest check that they have in their corner is this 3rd place finish at MDL, where they had some really, really good games. You'd have liked to see them perform a bit better at this recent Face It Invitational. They did lose to Empire in the only game that they played at that event, but you have to look at the squad and think that talent is very promising on paper. Navi is another team that certainly belongs in the discussion, although it's going to be really problematic. They finished at the lowest possible position at TI6, and they've only played 3 official matches since that tournament. I think a lot of people have Navi as at least a candidate to get in as the CIS representative. Certainly, you look at this team, they still have a lot of promise, but I don't think as a squad, when you had the kind of struggles that they had at TI, that you can come back and only play 3 official matches and realistically expect an invite. Alliance, again, a squad that I actually think has a lot of promise going forward. They're returning 2 out of their 5 players from TI. They're adding Limp and Hansken, who competed as a part of Complexity in the TI6 wildcard, and they're adding Jonas Samfan, another very promising Swedish offlane player that competed with those 2 as a part of the X Ninjas in Pajamas squad. They're 14-8 since TI6. The big problem for Alliance is that half their wins did come at this WESG tournament, which was a little bit of an unorthodox format. If you remember, this is the tournament where teams had to compete as a part of an all same country roster. Some of the games were very, very good. I did end up watching a lot of the games at this event. Alliance, I think if they had won may have made a bit of a case, but when you put together that a lot of the rosters that they were playing against were kind of unconventional, the fact that they didn't manage to win that event, they did show some promise recently in their debut at Dream League. They went 4-0 against NP and Escape, but again, they don't have the kinds of results necessarily against the elite teams that you'd really like to see to feel confident about projecting them as a direct invite. So we're going to talk about the 8 invites in groups of 3, 2, and 3, starting with the 3 teams that I consider to be more or less locks. It would be a huge shock if any of these 3 teams miss the cut. These are your top 3 teams from TI6. Again, EG is the only one that had multiple roster changes, and they did go into MDL and win that event, which is really the only undisputed premier land between TI6 and now. It would be a huge upset if any of these 3 teams were not on that 8-team list. Talk about the next 2. I really do feel that EHOME and Newbee getting in is very highly likely. You look at EHOME, they have 3 of 5 players from that TI6 roster, and the 2 that they're adding have just an incredible pedigree. You're talking about a TI5 champion in Garder that played for CDEC. You're talking about Sylar, who, in my opinion, not nearly enough people talk about him as an all-time great player. He's a 3-time top 3 TI finisher. This team is 41-19 since TI6. They're 11-3 over their last 10 days. They're really the only team since TI that's both played a lot of games and displayed the kind of dominance over teams in their region that you would expect to see from a team that's a lock for a direct invite. So I think it's highly likely that EHOME gets invited. And then when you look at Newbee, yes, they're only returning 2 out of 5 players from last season, but I'm going to go ahead and put them in the field largely on the strength that, number 1, they have played a lot of games since TI, and their record is pretty strong, not quite as dominant as EHOME, but they have a couple wins over EHOME. They've competed against Wings in one of Wings' only losses since TI was to Newbee, and that 2nd place finish at MDL. Guys, I think this is a case. A lot of these teams you're talking about don't have many appearances. You got to actually watch the games. When you're talking about projecting NCAA tournament bids, a lot of people talk about the eye test for March Madness. I think you have to apply the eye test to Newbee. They were the best team for much of MDL. They stumbled against EG in the finals. EG certainly vaulted themselves into lock status with that win, but I don't think you can penalize Newbee for that series. They've looked like a very, very good team, both at that LAN and in the vast majority of the games that they've played since TI. I'd be very surprised to see them left off the list. Now, the final 3 teams is where there's going to be a lot of disagreement. These are big, big time question marks. FNATIC, to me, you're largely basing their invite status on the fact that 2 out of their 5 players were TI top 4 finishers, and the remaining 3 were TI top 8 finishers with the same team. When you look at that roster, it's almost always been the case that the top 4 finishers from the previous major were locks for the next one. Even with all the roster turnover that FNATIC's had, I think that top 8 finish by TNC coming out of the lower bracket was enough to solidify FNATIC's spots. They haven't necessarily looked great in the 18 games that they've played since TI, but I think recently they avenged an earlier loss to Execration, beating them in the Summit 6 SEA qualifiers, and I think that's just enough that between that and the success of their rosters that FNATIC has cemented themselves a place. I know a lot of people were talking about Execration earlier on. They looked like they might be displaying that kind of regional dominance necessary to get that bid out of SEA. I just don't think that they've looked sufficiently convincing lately. That loss to FNATIC, I think, at the Summit qualifiers is going to loom large for them when invites do come out. And the last 2, OG and Liquid. These are going to be very highly controversial, maybe a little bit less so OG. Again, I think if you look at the way that they played at MDL, you look at the fact that 3 out of 5 players on their roster appeared in multiple major finals last year. Anna has shown a lot of promise since coming back over from IGV. I think there's enough in terms of both their pedigree and their track record that you're going to give them a nod over, say, a Team Secret. Team Secret, Again, I don't want to bring up the drama. We talked about that in a video that I made last week. I don't necessarily even think that that's going to be a deciding factor. I just think when you look at that roster, they're a little bit less tested with the 3 players coming over. They did have a top 4 MDL finish, but I just don't think that they've done quite enough to distinguish themselves and put them directly into this pool of direct invites. I think you have to give OG the nod over them. Liquid is probably going to be the pick that the most people disagree with. I think this is the one team that you say pretty clearly you're inviting based on potential. Remember last year, Secret getting that direct invite to the Shanghai Major, which they ended up winning. A lot of people took issue with that based on some of their performances between Frankfurt and Shanghai. But again, you look at the potential that this squad has on paper. 4 out of their 5 players appearing in 2 major finals last year. S4 being a TI3 champion, recently with Secret at TI4, played fairly well with Alliance over the course of the last season. I think there's enough there that Liquid will be invited based upon potential. And that's no slight intended to a number of the other teams. I think you can make a case, as I hope was clear when we were going through some of the previous slides. I think you can make a case for a lot of other teams, but at the end of the day, we just don't have a lot to go on in terms of resume strength. And I think you have to look at these 8 teams and say, do you really think there's another team out there that is clearly better based on a combination of the data since TI6, which we don't have much of, and just watching these matches and looking how the teams match up? There isn't a team that I can really look at and say they're clearly better than any one of these 8. So this is my best guess. Again, the last 3, particularly Liquid, a lot of uncertainty surrounding that prediction. So, the first 5 I'm pretty solid on. The last 3, if you already have your compendium predictions locked in, I'm not necessarily going to tell you to change them. This is just my best guess. Some brief comments here on 6.88F. We talked in the last Stats Don't Lie about the fact that in 6.88E, the changes to individual heroes overwhelmingly were nerfs. 26 out of 30 were nerfs, but by and large, the changes in that patch were not very big. That trend continues. All 18 of the individual heroes that were changed in this patch, once again, were nerfs, and a couple of these were extremely significant. I actually think Batrider at the pro level is the hero that was hurt worst by all of this. Batrider has probably been nerfed over the last couple of years more than any other hero in the game. He's been the hero that has remained super relevant in a shocking number of metas as we've gone along. Flame Break no longer interrupting channeling is a very, very big deal. It makes him a lot less scary in the laning phase in terms of his early kill potential. He does get an extra tick of damage, so that might help his farming potential a little bit in the jungle, might help his harassing potential in lane, but at the end of the day, a Batrider in the off lane or even a Batrider mid was scary, largely because if you get out of position against this hero at the early levels, he can easily get a sneaky kill on you. With Flame Break no longer being able to stop TPs, he's back in the same situation where maybe a Queen of Pain would be, or a Bloodseeker would be, where these heroes have a lot of damage potential, but if you get in trouble against them, they're very easy to just TP out against. Morphling and Odie, anytime you talk about base damage reduction, especially at the pro level, this is very, very highly significant. This is going to really hurt these 2 heroes in the laning phase. OD in particular, I think, gets absolutely, really crushed by that 6 base damage. I mean, you talk about that, that's half the hero's starting gold, okay? And Morphling, kind of the same thing. He's a hero that had been able to CS and even apply tower damage very early on in lane, thanks to his right clicks and that agility morph. That base damage reduction, though, potentially quite significant for the hero, maybe not quite as bad as OD. Drow Ranger, I think when you add the strength gain reduction, which is going to be about 30 to 50 HP coming out of the laning phase when you add everything up, and you talk about that plus the base damage reduction that she got in the previous patch, I think that she's going to be a lot less viable, although still always something that you have to worry about in terms of a niche pick or a pocket strat. Omni Knight is the real question mark to me because when you look at the 6.88E nerfs, it hasn't really moved his pub win rate. And you look at 6.88F, a number of heroes have already been seriously hurt. Drows and OD are good examples in terms of their pub win rates. Omni's pub win rate hasn't moved all that much, certainly given the 60% odd win rate that he started with in pubs. So I think that this is certainly going to be significant at high MMR levels. It's certainly going to be significant in terms of looking at his viability in the pro meta. I still think he's going to be a very strong hero. So again, apologies. I've got a couple midterms to write, so I'm going to have to cut this short. Thanks guys for listening. This is Nahaz, and I will see you guys soon.